This is the Kratom Science Journal Club with Dr. Jonathan Cachat, neuroscientist and expert in psychopharmacology. In each episode, we discuss an article in a peer-reviewed journal. I'm your host, Brian Gallagher, blog and social media writer for KratomScience.com, your source for all things Kratom. I guess I just wanted to say, okay, so we're going to be putting a poll on Twitter. Folks who listen to this podcast, what areas of Kratom Science would you like us to focus on? At Kratom Science, and check out the poll of what you want us to get into on this podcast, if anything.
So yeah, me and Brian have really enjoyed seeing the sort of discussions that unfold, and are happy to see that people are seeming to enjoy the journal club, where we dig into some of the science a little bit deeper. So what we were interested in doing is setting up a poll that Brian was just explaining, that has broad categories like, do you think we should look at an article or research in genetics, or how metragenine or metragenine is synthesized in the plant, so sort of plant biochemical physiology? Or would you be more interested in the next one being a cultural level type study, looking at sociology and different use patterns and trends, maybe even historical uses and how that has changed? And then, of course, we could get into neuroscience, brain systems, but there are different levels of analysis, different perspectives we could come from and look towards, and we want to make sure that we are keeping it fresh and interesting for all you guys. So if you want to help steer the direction of where the Journal Club goes, or even make an article recommendation yourself, please check out that poll and reach out to us at KratomScience.com.
Yeah, and that'll be on Twitter on @KratomScience. Okay, so the article we're talking about is called Kratom Instrumentalization for Severe Pain Self-Treatment Resulting in Addiction, a case report of acute and chronic subjective effects. And it was published in Helion, which is an open access journal, published recently. It's a case study of a young German man who was prescribed synthetic opioid Tilidine after a car accident, and he lives with chronic pain from that car accident. He tried Kratom for 3 months, stopped, then got on Kratom again for 3 months, then sought help to get off of the Kratom, and he also used Tilidine intermittently with the Kratom, or Tilidin. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. It seems as though he was using Kratom kind of as an opiate alternative, which some people who I've talked to who have gotten off of opiates say you shouldn't really do that. You should maybe stop, for a week every month or a couple days every month, just to keep your dose
tolerance
low.
Breaks.
Less
right,
is more.
Yeah.
Is a lot of what I hear from the Kratom community. It seems as though he was just increasing his dose. And then ultimately he was treated for his chronic pain with morphine, apparently, even though they don't really discuss that much in the study, how the morphine was introduced, but because it said pain management was successfully switched to ibuprofen and metamizole natrium. Can't find it.
Well, so yeah, we got a case report of this 26-year-old male. I think it's interesting just to make sure that we know that this was in Germany. So yes. The authors of this article are in a department of psychiatry and psychotherapy, I'm assuming at a clinic associated with the university, right? So basically, this 26-year-old male had a bone fracture in his foot, and was given morphine right after that accident. I got off the morphine and then started using Tilidine. And I don't know if we're saying it right either. Substitol is morphine in Germany. Tilidine is another synthetic opiate. I think it's fair to say, or just analogize, that the Tilidine is a synthetic opiate. It would be much like tramadol, so a sort of low to medium synthetic opiate used to treat pain. Whereas morphine, of course, would be like used in higher pain situations. So essentially, he goes to the hospital, uses morphine, gets the tramadol, wants to start backing away from the tramadol and seeking more natural options, starts using Kratom. There's a whole, a bunch of nuances there that we can get into, but ultimately he ends up going to these doctors seeking treatment for his Kratom use, and they help him detox, get off the Kratom, and ultimately put him back on morphine so he can manage his pain that way. So it's an interesting story with several twists and turns, but just interesting to note that both in the U.S. and in Germany, it seems that we are still stuck on this idea that people who are addicted to opiates should be treated with opiates. So I always giggle at that.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, which, I mean, it's probably because they don't know much about Kratom, and he was also getting his Kratom from a company called Thai Pimps, which which makes me think.
Yeah.
I mean, it automatically. I'm not sure the time period of this, but there was over in Sweden, 9 people died from a Kratom product called Krypton that was mixed with desmethyltramadol. Yeah.
Right.
So it
right.
wasn't
and so,
pure Kratom at all. So
and they say too that they took a sample from him, from this Thai Pimps, from their vendor, ran it through an LC-MS, and found, of course, they found mitragynine, but they also found hydromorphone in trace amounts, which is an opiate, it's like a chemical opiate.
I don't know if I saw that part.
Alterations in the product was found in what he went with. So I want to, small shout out sidebar. This is why the AKA is so heavily pushing for the truth in labeling initiative, which is very important, and it's important for keeping Kratom safe for everybody, keeping Kratom users safe, but also making sure that non-Kratom users understand that it is safe. So the whole labeling thing is there. But the other thing where you were headed, I think he got his Kratom from the internet, and it's weird how they're like, being a savvy 26-year-old, he used Google to find an internet vendor. But it seemed like he was explaining this to them, the 26-year-old, that the effectiveness of the Kratom as he was using it was diminishing. So it was just self-reported. But my question is, and it would be interesting to know, was he just using Kratom from the same vendor, from the same company, every single time, and not trying to switch between different manufacturers or different suppliers or different methods of administration? It's not uncommon for you to sort of, get used to the same plant-based product if you use it over and over again. And so mixing things up and having some diversity in where that plant matter is coming from, he might have been able to avoid this loss of effectiveness.
Yeah, and if it was adulterated with an opiate, that seems to make sense that he would keep using more and more and more of it, especially since there might have been trace amounts in there.
Yeah. I didn't think about that. He was actually developing a rapid tolerance to hydromorphinone. I don't know if it was in all of them.
Yeah.
But
yeah, but how did it get into one? How did it get into? And like a reputable company, you wouldn't accidentally drop an opiate into their Kratom.
Well, Thai Pimps is pulling the oldest move in the book: Coca-Cola. Make a drink, add a little Coke, they'll be back for more.
They should bring that back. I'd like to try it, just on a weekend or something.
The original recipe.
The original recipe, yeah. And it also said in the study that he was also taking the Tylenol intermittently with the Kratom. So it doesn't seem like, he kind of did the Kratom thing right.
It seems like he, though, went to Kratom. It was effective for him. And so, we should talk a bit about instrumentalization. But in this case, the individual, our 26-year-old, instrumentalized Kratom or used Kratom as an instrument to achieve pain management and drive enhancement. So it's a behavioral activation, right? He did this and consumed daily for 3 months, during which time he it was reported that he developed a tolerance to the analgesic effects over time. So he was taking 16 grams a day for 3 months. Then it jumped up to 30 grams a day. So he changed the amount with slight adjustments to the dosage. But it seems that even at the higher dose, it lost the ability to act as the instrument he was trying to achieve. He wasn't getting pain management, and he wasn't giving the behavioral drive enhancement. And I also think it's important to note here, like the researchers did, when he was consuming, up to 30 grams a day, that ends up costing about 300 to 400 euro per month. And so, now this is a guy who it was effective. He started taking more, but gosh, now it's not really working for him. He didn't have a buddy that said, take a tolerance break, slow down, take a lower dose. I often hear more often than not, especially on Reddit and other forums, that, lower doses are more effective. And I've had that myself where, you take too much and you get those eye wobbles and you're like, this is not what I wanted. Now I got to just lay down and be done with it. You say take less is more. It seems to be for Kratom. But the nail on the coffin was, and I'm spending $300 to $400 a month on this stuff. I must be addicted. I must need to go seek treatment. And then he walks into this place.
And so drug instrumentalization is kind of a concept that this researcher, Muller, is kind of talking about in various studies that he did. But I'm just going to read. Drug instrumentalization describes the use of a psychoactive drug by a non-addicted individual in order to better reach non-drug-related goals in life, as opposed to drug-related goals. Drug instrumentalization goals, otherwise known as consumatory motives, may include improvement of social interaction, improved cognitive performance, or better work performance. And my question was, isn't the reason that everybody takes any drug some kind of goal to improve how you feel, at least? Or
right.
He seems to divide the motivations for drugs into euphoria, which would be I want to get high, versus my back hurts and I can't work if my back hurts this bad.
That was my exact initial reaction to this notion of instrumentalization. And I think as we chatted earlier, it to me, my first gut reaction was, well, if a person's taking a drug to have better performance at work, let's say like an ADHD medication, like an amphetamine, right? They're taking it for the purpose of improving their focus and work productivity, but just you're still getting the euphoria. Like the drug's in your system, It's still working on your brain's reward system. So, just a setting is very important, but, telling yourself, well, this is not for feeling good. This is for getting work done. And then you pop a pill. And the pill doesn't care what you said before. It's going to just act how it acts. So I was sort of, what's going on here? Why do we need this concept of instrumentalization? But so I decided to dig into it a little bit more, because it does seem to be, the third author, which is typically the most senior scientist, Christian P. Muller, in the article we're reviewing here. He has a 2011 large report or paper in Behavioral Brain Sciences called Drugs as Instruments, a new framework for non-addictive psychoactive drug use. And so I mentioned this because now that I read it in this perspective, I think what he's doing here is actually kind of genius. So essentially, there are a lot of scientists who are trying to figure out how people get addicted to drugs and how we can help drug addicts, right? That has resulted in, National Institute of Drug Abuse, where I got my grant money from. We had to study drug abuse. We had to get things addicted to things and then study what their addictive state was like, and hopefully learn something that will help humans that end up being addicted, right? So there are inherent biases and cognitive frameworks within that paradigm. So if someone is addicted to a drug, let's say you're already addicted, the scientists who are studying addiction automatically assume if you're an addict, you're taking that substance because it makes you feel good. You're doing it because you want the hedonistic pleasure. Your brain's reward system, which we talked about in the last episode, that mesolimbic pathway in the nucleus accumbens, has been quote-unquote hijacked, and the only way to get that good feeling is by continuing to consume your drug, right? So, we're pushing addicts sort of into a corner, and if you're an addict and you're taking a drug, you're doing it because you want to feel good. Where Muller starts off on this was real interesting is that, look, people take drugs. People have been taking drugs since the beginning of drugs and the beginning of time and the beginning of humans around the world. And more often than not, the majority of people who consume psychoactive drugs, the drugs that have addiction potential, are not addicts and don't become addicted.
Yeah.
So the very idea that you take a drug, you become addicted is out the window. Most people, by far, across the world, can take heroin or cocaine and not become addicted to it to the point where, they start ruining their lives and losing relationships. So where he lays this out is to say, although drug addiction is an undeniable and major burden to society, to a considerable degree, the use of psychoactive drugs is unrelated to addiction, and we need to tease those things apart. And there's this great, history of teasing those things apart. If you wanted to help the addicts, what you really want to understand is the people who don't become addicts when they use things that could be addictive. And so the article gets into, different evolutionary traits, starting with, prepping food and getting plants for nutrition and seeking out certain types of plants or meats or whatever, berries or flowers to achieve a specific goal. And in that case, like way back in the day, they're looking for dandelions today because, I don't know, we need no botanists to tell us what it's good for. But essentially, for the longest time, our species has been selectively ingesting plants to achieve goals based on how we're currently feeling.
Yeah.
And
the reason people take drugs is part of our evolution, essentially.
Well, yeah. I mean, the reason that humans seek out specific plants to consume has been around since the very beginning, because it doesn't make sense that there's these plants that just exist in the world that, one of them has cocaine on it, one of them has cannabinoids. It just doesn't make sense that these plants would have drug compounds in them that react to specific receptors in our brain. That's another episode. But the notion of us selectively getting these plants and consuming them for specific reasons is a very old one. And then we get into different theories and concepts and frameworks on learning behavior and learning memory, and how you begin to associate like mental effects or behavioral effects or physiological feelings after consumption of something, how that gets reinforced. And there's 3 or 4 different, frameworks that are presented here. But, basically the take-home point of what Muller is saying with this instrumentalization is that if we actually want to study and prevent addiction, then we need to understand how people make that transition to addiction and how the purpose of them using that drug or as an instrument to achieve a certain end, at what point does that switch from, I was using this, I was drinking, I had a little bit of alcohol because I just wanted to feel loose and, smile, lay back, maybe hit on someone for a little bit.
Yeah.
At what point does that instrumental use of beer switch to, I'm drinking this beer because I need it, and I don't really care about where I'm at or where anybody else is at. That's a distinct switch in motivations there. And so what he's trying to do with this instrumentalization framework is study that specific window, that switch and transition from non-addiction to addiction. And I got to give him mad props on that. For as much as I sort of scoffed at the idea and, might have in my head said, oh God, this is one of those scientists that's just trying to make a philosophical semantic argument, using different words when in reality, it's not even about what it's about. But when I actually read the motivation behind it in context of addiction science, it makes tons of sense. And yeah, that article is a super good read. Drugs as Instruments, a new framework for non-addictive psychoactive drug use. And I also just want to double down and appreciate that it's often not realized that most people who consume psychoactive compounds that have addiction potential do not become addicted. And so, I don't know, maybe it's from growing up in the Midwest, especially when opiates started sort of just rip roaring through America. But I remember, I've been told by DARE officers, well, if you smoke weed once, you're going to be addicted forever.
Yeah.
It's like, well, not only is that not true, but you've then set up the expectation in that young mind that, well, if I smoke it once, I guess I'm addicted, and that's me forevermore. And, that's the lifestyle I'm going to take. So it's just, I'm happy that you and I are doing this so we can get some sort of objective and critical information on drug use out there, because Lord knows DARE wasn't doing it right.
Yeah, I actually remember a cop saying that exact thing. I mean, it said long-term use of Kratom changed the emotional status of the patient, which he recognized himself. It led to a dulling of bodily perceptions and emotional reactions to environmental stimulation, blah, blah, blah. In particular, music perception and production, I guess his productivity or something, no longer induced positive feelings.
I also, when they read that, the change of the emotional status of the patient, this, that, the other thing, they don't acknowledge, and I don't know if they thought about it, but you also got to keep in mind that, like, when he started this, the accident occurred when he was like 23, maybe 22, and now he's 26. And so that's, 23, 26. This guy could also have just, been met and faced with the reality of adulthood and adulting and, the understanding that he's no longer a kid and he needs to participate in the society and work for the man and give taxes to the man and pay bills. That sort of getting tossed to the wolves of real life around that age, is a big sort of life milestone that affects people differently. But I just said, change the emotional state when he recognized dulling of body perceptions. Dude could have just been depressed because he's like, yeah, well, now I'm an adult and now I got to do adulting all the time.
Yeah.
Yes,
Music is definitely better when you have less responsibilities. It's good to reiterate that this is just a case study, it's just one guy's experience, so you can't really make generalizations about whatever substance based on one person's experience.
Certainly. And it's also a case study written by addiction treatment professionals.
Okay.
So it's just worth noting that, like, they had someone come into their office who said they were addicted to something and they'd like them to help get him off. So they did that. And I'm assuming then they asked him questions, gathered some life histories, but they certainly weren't measuring blood cortisol levels or taking objective physiological measurements. They were just basically taking this guy's word for it, which is fine, I suppose, but it doesn't certainly speak to the real mechanisms behind what's going on. And so, yeah, it's just, and with all science too, Brian, I'll just make a blanket statement. Any study, good scientists are skeptical, right? So take everything with a grain of salt and talk it over with other smart people who can maybe shed light on different things.
Questions about science in general, because there was another blog that posted about this, and he kind of painted them as shills for the big pharma, which the mechanism of how this works, I mean, this isn't necessarily an anti-kratom study. There's several statements in there that, say that kratom could be, effective in treatment for opiates. And are there scientists out there that do studies and think, well, hey, maybe the big pharma will give me tons of cash? And
so that guy was essentially saying that the authors of this study, so Christian Muller, is a shill for big pharma. That's basically what his gripe was.
Kratom installation, blah, 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 proposes an absolutely evil theory, which is that kratom users should be treated with morphine and then take morphine long-term. I don't think the study says that at all, and I had a polite exchange with the guy on Twitter about, I don't think it says that.
Right.
The idea that there are scientists out there that are taking big bags of cash from big pharma, and so they're going to just tell a lie, I don't think it kind of works like that. I mean, I know there are sponsored studies from, pharmaceutical companies that might want to make their products look better than they are. But what do you think about that? How that works?
Yeah. First off, it doesn't seem like that guy did a critical reading of this paper, all 3 pages of it, and just sort of was like, oh, this is bad for the kratom narrative. Let's trash it, right? So I'm actually real glad that you suggested this one. Even though there would be concern that this is portrays kratom in a bad way, we want to be sort of objective about the science for reading and stuff. So I in no way at all think that this article or case study demonizes kratom or really presents any new evidence that would lead me to change my beliefs on the effectiveness of kratom for the various ways that people use it, right? So I think he was probably just reacting to like the headline and wanted to make sure everybody knew where he stood. We'll leave it at that. In regards to your question about scientists and influence from big pharma and like, are there shills and this, that, and the other thing? There's different levels to everything, right? Most importantly, I was sort of disillusioned a bit once I got to graduate school and was in the lab on the day-to-day because, first of all, science is very expensive, like stupidly expensive, where you're buying a glass beaker and it costs $35, right? It's just ridiculous. So there's that. You need to have a lot of money to do it, and you got to get that money from somewhere. But also, you just have to realize and remember that scientists are normal people too, like everyone else. The sort of idea of scientists are they're in a lab with a white lab jacket on. They are, intently studying something, and they are reporting what they found almost sort of robotically, right? With as little emotion or sort of motivated manipulation at all, right? Like a scientist is this pristine, fact truth teller. At the end of the day, scientists are people, right? And they get woken up by their kids, they're newborn at 3 a.m, and they're irritable and they don't know what they're doing, and they want to get tenure, and the only way you can get tenure is by getting grants and publishing papers, right? They're under all sorts of logistical pressures to maintain or advance their position within the system. Yeah. Just like any other profession, right? So because that's true, it is certainly true that scientists are susceptible to getting paid money at the expense of their credibility. for example, there are plenty of scientists through the 70s, even to today, that are paid by fossil fuel companies, and they'll argue till they're blue in the face that climate change is not happening as a result of our increased CO2 emissions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know, if they believe what they're saying, or if they've convinced themselves that they're saying, or they're cherry-picking data. At any rate, the answer to your question is yes, it's possible, and yes, it happens. Now, in this case, these guys aren't pushing any specific product or alternative. They're just doing what is the medical standard, treating opiate addicts with longer-lasting opiates. They do it in Germany. They do it here. I would say that sort of paradox or conundrum that we find ourselves in is much more a result of political pressure that involves who donates money to who and who gets on what state medical board and who doesn't. And, that sort of political runaround is mucking up the works in the true science. You see it all the time. I mean, it took Ohio so long to even consider the idea that medical cannabis should be legal. And they were, and to a large extent, still remain against it. I mean, I remember asking John Kasich, he asked what I did. I said, I'm a doctor. And he goes, oh, you treat people. And I go, well, no, I'm a research scientist, PhD. And he goes, oh, what do you research? And I said, drugs, cannabis. And he was like, why would you do that? There's nothing there. He's already filed these compounds away in his head as bad, not worth anything, and stay away from them. I can't help that. That's his problem, not mine.
Yeah.
And so the other thing too, along these lines, as we get to the end there, so they helped him detox from the kratom. If he were to show up and I were to have an addiction clinic and he was still in pain, he was able to get off the pharmaceuticals and use kratom, but the kratom's becoming less effective. Before I sent him down the path of pharmaceutical drugs, which, as we've talked about, are this 99% pure chemical compound that is, a very modern, very processed, very, clean product, I would talk to him about his kratom use. Using kratom and the plant matter, you're not being exposed to that pure 99% pure compound. And so the way it affects you is going to be different. And I found nothing here that they discussed different methods of administration of kratom. So he was using it in capsules. So first I would have started, have you bought kratom from any other sources? That would be a good place to start, right? Have you considered tolerance breaks? And then have you considered different methods of administration? So he was using capsules. You could do it as a tea. Does he know that there are extracts that exist so you don't have to take as much plant matter, et cetera, et cetera. And so as a psychopharmacologist, you got to, always remind people the dose is one thing, but the method of administration is almost more critical. And so if he hadn't tried any of that, he just got the capsules from the same person for 3 years and ate him as capsules, I'm kind of not surprised that the effects started to diminish. I mean, really, over that amount of time, it just sort of becomes this habit that the body is not even really aware of, right? So if you were mixing it up a little bit, he probably wouldn't have fallen into this situation where they got him back on the pharmaceuticals. It's interesting because a lot of times loved ones will not accept a natural alternative over the pharmaceutical alternative because they think, oh, well, if it's plant matter, it's a drug. It's not medicine. If you want medicine, you take a pill. And that's a really sort of very modern, very American, very dangerous mindset to be in.
Listen to me. Listen to me.
Oh, cool. So we got some audience questions.
Oh, yeah. There's
questions.
like
Love
6 or 7 of them. But this one guy commented on our last journal club a week ago, and his username's Rectangled. And it's just a general question. He goes, "Hey man, can I ask if kratom can be bad, like the negatives? I've heard some people bring that up, but I would love to know more from a professional such as yourself." I assume he's addressing you and not me. But can kratom be bad? I mean, all right, open-ended question there.
All right, can kratom be bad? Well, the short answer is sure, yes.
Yeah.
But can milk be bad? Yes. Can water be bad? Yes. Too much water, I think they refer to that as drowning. So it would be helpful to define bad. I'm making an assumption that if someone's asking that question, they're either evaluating whether they want to take it or
Yes.
they want to take it, and someone is telling them not to because they think it's bad.
Yeah.
I'm going to just get philosophical here to say from an ethics perspective that I'm an Aristotelian guy. Everything in moderation, right? So with all psychoactive drugs, with all medications, with anything, all consumption, anything has the potential to be bad if used in excess or irresponsibly. So, there's that. That said, if he's considering taking it for, treating, let's say, some pain or some aches and pains, and he's saying, look, I could take Advil or Tylenol, or maybe he's already on some prescription opiates and he wants to get off of them. In that scenario, I would say no way that kratom's bad. I mean, I think that kratom, just like cannabis, these natural plant alternatives that aren't these synthesized, isolated chemicals, provide the body with a more diverse, complex set of molecules to interact with. And, it's been sort of what we've been doing for most of our time on this planet. Short answer, what was his name?
That was Rectangle. He's from YouTube. He commented on our last pod.
Oh, on the YouTube. Okay, yeah. But his name's Rectangle?
Yeah.
So Rectangle's short answer is kratom bad. My answer is no. Just don't abuse it in excess because anything can be bad if consumed or exposed to in unreasonable levels. Longer answer is depends what you're using it for, depends how responsibly you're using it, and the alternatives that you've also considered to do instead of kratom, right? So I wouldn't just rule it out and say it's bad. I think that's a bad move.
Yeah. All right, that's a good answer. And this is kind of a related question. It's from Liberty Russ, Trap House Russ on Twitter, and he's been following me for a while, and I've been following him. And he just had a general question: what are the long-term effects of kratom on brain function?
Good question, Trap House Russ.
Yep.
I don't think he's following me, but come on, Trap House, holler at your boy. I'll give you a follow too. His question is, what are the long-term effects on the brain of kratom use? So the short answer is we don't know. The more detailed answer would go, I think, a little bit something like this. So I got to use other drugs just to contextualize the sort of range of possibilities here. Cannabinoids found in the cannabis plant are the most potent and effective neuroprotective compounds we know of on the planet. You can look in the science journals to find support for that statement. I generally direct people to look at the patent held by the federal government of the United States Health Department on the use of cannabinoids as neuroprotectants and antioxidants, because most people don't know that the federal government both says there's no medical value while also holding the patent. Also, when I was in Israel at a cannabis conference, it was interesting to learn that on the battlefield, the medics there have Listerine strips in their like belt ready to go, because if there's 4 guys in a car and they drive over an IUD and everybody gets rattled, they'll give them cannabinoids on the battlefield immediately to try to reduce swelling in the brain and damage to the brain. This is also why cannabinoids and cannabis are great for neurodegenerative diseases. So I'll back up off of cannabis there. But look, if your parents are starting to age or maybe are already showing signs of dementia or Parkinson's, I would strongly encourage you to start getting them on cannabinoids, even if it's just CBD. My parents don't have a choice in that regard. Moving on from that. So cannabis, long-term effects of cannabis, it is very extremely neuroprotective. MDMA, Molly, ecstasy, it's an amphetamine. There is something called serotonergic syndrome or serotonin toxicity. Too much serotonin released in your brain, which could be induced by a drug like ecstasy, can lead to oxidative damage and can lead to loss of neuronal cells. It can perpetuate a toxic environment in your brain that over repeated long-term living in this setting, the brain will start to show brain damage that we can measure in not only brain imaging scans, but also in like increased cytokines, decreased activity in certain areas, et cetera. So amphetamines, long-term use of amphetamines can cause brain damage. Another one would be like alcohol too. I mean, you can Google that real quick and say, show me the brain of a chronic alcoholic and the brain of someone who doesn't consume alcohol. There could be some clear signs there, but with alcohol, it's sort of just globally causing problems. There's nothing really specifically happening, but it shrinks brain sizes, this, that, and the other thing. Is Kratom bad for your brain in the long term? Like I said at the beginning, we don't know. What we do know is that Kratom has been around for a while. It is growing in popularity now in the Western world. It has been, really for the last, probably 2 decades, but now more and more people are becoming aware of it. I haven't ever heard of a long-term Kratom user like just spontaneously explode or, spontaneously develop a hole in their brain, right? Yeah, so there's no indication in the length of time that humans have been consuming Kratom that spontaneous brain explosion is a possible thing that could happen. If something that severe and that drastic could occur, we'd already know about it. The compounds that are in Kratom that are exerting these psychological effects are unique to Kratom and have not been thoroughly investigated in a neurobiology lab yet, right? And so depending on where the funding comes from, like we were talking earlier, you get money from NIDA, National Institutes of Drug Abuse, you better believe one of your papers is going to be, we gave them Kratom until their brain exploded. And they'll
like
and
with
they'll
the zebrafish and the caffeine.
Right, exactly. Or this other story, dude, there was this, like I think I said this earlier, LSD has a very safe therapeutic window.
Yeah,
there isn't really a lethal dose. There's a study, though, where at a zoo somewhere, they gave so much LSD to an elephant, it eventually died.
Oh,
and then, of course,
God.
that was in the
Did
headline.
It kill a bunch of people first?
I mean, and it was like,
why did they do that to the damn elephant? That is fucked up.
Yeah. It's fucked up, and it might as well have been a gallon of LSD.
Oh, my God.
So, of course, that made the headlines to say, oh, LSD will kill you. Better be careful. LSD won't kill you, buddy. Drinking a gallon of it, if you weigh as much of as an elephant, might.
If I see somebody do that to an elephant, I might kill that person.
And then at that point, it's like, did they die, or are they just now in a new dimension? Because I don't know what's going on at that point.
And why waste? That's enough LSD to fund a whole Grateful Dead tour. Why waste it all?
Yeah, it was probably confiscated, and they're like, "Look, we need to really get some headlines about this being dangerous. So I want you to pump that elephant with so much LSD he dies."
Damn.
Oh, it's
I
horrible.
mean, an elephant
especially
on like a little microdose of it might be interesting, but Jesus, wow.
Yeah, with the brain of the elephants. Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine it. I'll save this for another episode, but I wanted to give LSD to color-changing octopus in the worst way. And
God,
it's
that would have
still
been
a goal
awesome.
Of mine. Yeah, it's still a goal of mine.
We'll
but let's
talk
save
about
that. We can unpack that at another time.
Together. Okay, so we got Jennifer Van Blanc, who's awesome. Every time I talk to her, I find out more about addiction. She was addicted to opiates, and she got off it with Kratom. But her question is, can we measure the effects of Kratom when it comes to the anti-anxiety, antidepressant effects? Is there a way to inarguably prove that Kratom eases / erases those issues? And I guess a related question is from Kendall Clark, and he said, can you list exactly which receptors Kratom binds to and their relative potency compared to other drugs?
Yeah,
those are two different questions,
there.
really. But
very good questions. Thank you, guys, and loving the engagement here, and happy to answer.
They were both guests
question.
on my podcast too, Kendall and Jen.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
nice. So keep the questions coming. I don't care how far out of left field they are. This one, although, is pretty straightforward. So
yeah.
The first part is mechanistically what's going on with Kratom that leads to a reduction of anxiety or stress, right? So that's interesting. You have to unpack the notion of stress and anxiety from a neuroscientist perspective. That can get messy and nuanced. What I think I'll say is that in the case of Kratom, and also in the case of like many other drugs, if you're taking something with the goal of reducing the amount of pain you're in, if that thing you take reduces your pain, your anxiety, I'm assuming, then goes with that, right? People are getting anxious about worrying about being in pain. So just the act of removing pain can be a very anxiolytic process. There could be, and there probably is, much more going on at the molecular level with the activity of the kratom alkaloids at different receptors, right? So, like, if you want to talk psychopharmacology, what we typically give people for anti-anxiety medications or benzodiazepines, what they do is increase the activity of GABA, a neurotransmitter conserved in all animals. That is the primary inhibitory transmitter, meaning when GABA is signaling, it is telling the neurons it's signaling with to stop signaling. So depressed, hit the brakes, right? And so really, when people take benzos, their entire central nervous system is getting sort of slowed down and relaxed. So if you are overthinking things or, stressed out in your head, they can feel very effective. Whether or not they actually remove the anxiety, I think it is to be debated. They just broadly depress the activity of the nervous system. And last little caveat there is that humans, as far as we know, are the only animals that are able to sync themselves into a physiological stress response. There's a great book on this by Robert Sapolsky called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Like, for a zebra, lion's a stressful event, but other than that, they're not worried about the stock market or how their sports team's performing or, other sort of inferior human type things.
Yeah.
And so, it's, you can't just say anxiety and stress is one thing caused by one thing and manifested mechanistically in one way, especially in humans. So there's much more to learn there, as we talked in the last time, and I think where we're going in the answer to the next question, where the receptors they're binding to and what activity is happening, we're just now getting those studies, and we're just now seeing that it's going into dopaminergic signaling, serotonergic signaling, noradrenergic and adrenaline signaling. And so I don't think we've seen GABA signaling or glutamate signaling yet, but those, turning those on or off can also lead to a depressed nervous system activity. But it's up to all of us in the Kratom community to push for additional studies, because if we figure out what it is mechanistically doing to relieve stress, and it's a novel mechanistic way that it's achieving that, we've now made a rather monumental discovery on how the human brain works.
Okay, the one question is from Mark Davidson, and he says the advantage and disadvantages of taking Kratom during the pandemic. In general, does Kratom boost immunity, and do we know enough about that yet?
So, a very interesting question. And if you think about what makes you, right? You have your brain and all the chemical soup that's there, right? And you're reacting to input into your sensory organs. But once we get below the brainstem, the interaction of the nervous system with the immune system is a critical junction that makes you and makes you feel how you are and behave or act or think. Anyways, it's enormously important beyond just protecting you from bad things that come from the environment. So I think I'd like to do this. I don't know and haven't looked into any research on kratom or mitragynine effects on suppressing or enhancing or no effect on the immune system. Yeah. I would suggest essentially maybe we find a paper on that for the next one. We can look at something on how kratom interacts with the immune system.
That could be one of the poll answers, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. That'd be cool. I don't know enough off the top of my head to be able to answer that.
I don't think there is much, really, but there might be something out there.
As part of the previous question, they were specifically asking about what receptors the kratom compounds bind to, and when I'm guessing when they were asking about potency differences or potency comparisons, they were asking about binding affinity. So, like, does mitragynine bind to the mu-opiate receptor with a stronger binding affinity than hydrocodone? I also don't know those numbers off the top of my head. You could look into what is called pharmacokinetics, and there's probably a table that exists on those binding affinities. But I would be happy, and frankly, I think we discussed all those receptors and the interactions in the second episode of the Journal Club podcast.
Yeah, and I think there was a good study about that by Andrew Krugel, but it came out a couple years ago, but I don't. He's one of the guys that studies kratom a lot that I see. And the last question we have is from Marc Swogger, who I've had on before. He's a social scientist up in University of Rochester, and I had him as a guest before. We had a really good discussion. But he has a neuroscience question in general. I'll just read it. So Marc Swogger says, given that neuroscience uncovers mostly correlations, how do we push back against the assumption that brain activity always causes the mind and not vice versa? As an example, successful psychotherapy modifies fMRI results. I wonder which is primary, psychedelic occasion, mystical experiences, or biological underpinnings? Or do mind and brain exist separately and interact as is suggested by some results in physics? Did you get that?
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that loaded gun. It's a great question, and I understand this sort of dig at neuro. It is very mechanistic. So neuroscience is not strictly correlational, but if you're doing brain imaging studies, that's not just neuroscience, it's psychology or psychiatry or any number of different disciplines that are doing brain imaging studies. Yes, things end up being very correlational, and of course we can't get causation from correlation. Neuroscience to me, though, is about integrating information from different levels of analysis. So like, looking at serotonin transporter gene alleles and how they're expressed differently is something one neuroscience lab could do. But then we could also be looking at serotonergic drugs and how it changes behavior in a behavioral lab, right? neuroscience to me represents an attempt to integrate across those levels of analysis in a way that more accurately reflects what the nervous system actually is, a very complex, dynamic, always active, always changing system from genes to environment. And I'll also want to acknowledge and appreciate where he's coming from in that I've spent a lot of time, at the after parties of conferences trying to convince my neuroscience colleagues that if you want to understand anxiety or depression, we need to stop digging so far into the brain and start looking out of the brain, and how things that are external to the brain actually change the brain's physiology. So technically, my degree is in social neuroscience. It was started by a man named John Cacioppo over at the University of Chicago. I spent the summer with him. And the central tenet of social neuroscience is essentially like the things that affect the external factors that you are around and in affect your brain and your brain's activity just as much, if not more, than any sort of genetic differences or neurotransmitter concentration differences. And, unfortunately, I would say it's still an uphill battle to get neuroscientists to realize that. But I think we're getting a lot closer, and I think you said something about psychedelics and sort of the dissolving of this or that or the other thing. What's nice is that at least with psychedelics, we can approach that from a neuroscientist perspective to say everything's more connected and everybody feels more connected when our sort of ego gets out of the way and our default network programming can shut down for a minute. And we realize that we're all part of this complex system. Of course, there's interesting studies that look at the differences between Western brains and Eastern brains. Eastern cultures are much more holistic and about the group, whereas in Western cultures, it's the individual who's the hero of the story. And that manifests itself in different brain activities and how the brain works. And so I think, to answer his question on the mind and the brain and the differences and where does one start and where does one end and how do we tackle that question, or what's my opinion on that question, I would just offer. So I would say my answer to his question about the mind, where's the mind start and the brain end, and what does the neuroscientist say about that, would be, I look forward to meeting you someday and having a conversation about that, because it's a question that has been asked since the beginning of time, and science is just one way to approach answering that question. There are, of course, many other disciplines who have different answers and different traditions. At least the good thing about neuroscientists, as I know it, is that it hopes to integrate all of that information. And I don't know if we're ever going to truly know where, when, and maybe the mind is culture, and there's different types of minds, hive minds, this, that, and the other thing. Luckily, with plants like Kratom and psychedelics and all the other controlled substances that are confabulated into the harsh term drugs, the more we can get people to understand that there are differences there, I think the closer we can get to using advancements in modern technology to probe consciousness with tools like those compounds. But of course, there's always more to life than what's in your brain and what the molecules are doing. And so I appreciate the question. The answer is there is no answer, and I look forward to meeting you someday so we can see if we can figure it out.
You know what? I mean, I was going to ask him. I just asked you about today. I was going to ask if he wants to come on, and we'll have maybe like a Zoom thing, and you guys can talk about it. He's done a lot of Kratom studies, and he did one with, there's a webpage called Arrowit, that's been out since the 90s, and he did a...
Oh, I know about Irwin, yeah.
Oh, yeah, and he did a study with the people that run that page. Yeah, well, shout out to Dr. Swogger, shout out to Arrowwood, and shout out to Dr. Cachat. Yo, for more information on all things Kratom, check out KratomScience.com. Music is by Captain Big Wheel. The song is Moon Runner. Take care.